World War II was brutal, and especially so in North Africa, where hundreds of tanks and aircraft were destroyed, and thousands of young soldiers were killed. This is a story about 9 young Americans who took off on their first mission in a brand new aircraft, but ended up dying of starvation in the middle of the Sahara Desert. If you're fragile or you're easily depressed, maybe you should watch something else. The fact that the American Army Air Force was having to use a dirt airfield in Libya was a testament to the military prowess of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who, with his German Panzer Division, had wreaked havoc across a wide expanse of North Africa. The 9 young airmen who I previously mentioned arrived at the Soluk Air Base in Libya on March 18, 1943. They were assigned to a new B-24 Liberator named Lady Be Good. The pilot was First Lieutenant William Hatton. Second Lieutenants Robert Toner was the co-pilot, D.P. Hayes was the navigator, and John Waravka was the bombardier. Tech Sergeants Harold Ripslinger was the flight engineer, and Robert Lamotte was the radio operator. Staff Sergeants Guy Shelley, Vernon Moore, and Samuel Adams were gunners. On April 4th, they flew their first mission together. They were one of 25 B-24s that had been assigned to bomb the harbour of Naples in a late afternoon attack. But the mission had been plagued from the start. A howling sandstorm had delayed their takeoff, and the longer the aircraft waited on the runway, the more sand their engines ingested. After the leading aircraft had taken off, 8 of them had engine trouble and had to return to base. The Lady Be Good, which took off 90 minutes later, had been expected to follow the more experienced aircraft all the way to Naples. But after 3 hours, they'd found themselves more or less alone and fighting a ferocious crosswind that had blown them far off course. And as the remaining 17 aircraft leveled off at their cruising altitude of 25,000 feet, many of the men began to suffer from the extreme cold. One aircraft made an emergency descent in an attempt to revive a man who'd stopped breathing after his oxygen mask had frozen to his face. Back in North Africa, things were heating up. German and Italian forces in Tunisia, under the command of Field Marshal Rommel, were suddenly attacked by American and British forces under the command of General Bernard Montgomery.
Toil and sweat, and some of the blood was evident as MOs dealt with casualties at an advanced dressing station.
The Battle of Wadi Akarit was an effort by the Allies to dislodge the armies of the Axis power from their defensive positions, held along the Wadi Akarit in Tunisia. After several determined counterattacks, the Axis forces finally withdrew, and Montgomery's forces could celebrate a rare victory at a time when it looked as if the war might go on forever. During their flight, the Lady Be Good had suffered from navigational problems, compounded by strong crosswinds and heavy cloud cover, and after more than 4 hours in the air, they found themselves not over Naples, but 140 miles to the east. This was their first mission. All the men were angry, and arguments broke out over the intercom. But finally, William Hatton, their pilot, brought the aircraft down to 10,000 feet, set a course back to their base in Libya, and then dumped all of their bombs into the ocean. They were going home. Navigating at night had proven difficult. Typically, on a clear night, the navigator could use the North Star and a sextant to determine one's approximate location. The radio operator operated a radio direction finder, which would take a compass bearing from 2 known AM radio transmitters broadcasting from different cities. Those bearings would be plotted using lines on a map, and you'd find yourself where the 2 lines intersected. But with heavy cloud cover, the navigator found himself unable to use his sextant, and during a radio call from Lady Be Good to their base in Libya, they reported that their radio direction finder wasn't working. So the pilot told the radio operator to contact the British Air Base in Benghazi and ask for the Lady Be Good's compass heading. They responded by saying 330, which was exactly the heading they'd flown out on 10 hours earlier. In other words, they were right on course. Sometime just after midnight, and thinking that they were still flying over the Mediterranean Sea, the Lady Be Good and her young crewmen flew right over their airbase and continued flying south into the blackened heart of the Sahara Desert. Later that night, as their fuel was running out, the exhausted young men made another bad decision. Believing that they were still over the open ocean and with only one of their 4 engines still running, the men decided to bail out of their aircraft. Why was this a bad decision? Because the aircraft could have sheltered them, was filled with survival rations, many gallons of water, emergency radios, and most importantly, flare guns that they could have used to get the attention of aircraft that would be searching for them. But after the men bailed out, the Lady Be Good continued to fly on its own for another 16 miles. Prior to 1940, few areas of the world were as inaccessible as the Libyan desert, a vast and lifeless wasteland of sand and stone, nearly the size of India. And it was here that 8 of the 9 young men now found themselves. I said 8, not 9, because one of them had already died when his parachute had failed to open. The rest of the men sat in the sand and waited for daylight. And then, as a group, they began walking toward the north, to their airbase, 400 miles away. Back at the Soluk Air Base, the squadron commander was furious. He'd discovered that the British had ignored a second call for help from the Lady Be Good. He also found out that several men had heard the Lady Be Good as it flew over the base around midnight. The British commander defended his actions, citing the need for radio silence. But now the American commander was forced to organize a rescue operation that would risk even more American lives. In Ladies' Men, a book written by Mario Martinez, he quotes a pilot who participated in the search. Lieutenant Dean Christie said they flew grid patterns for 2 or 3 days, reaching as far as 380 miles south of the airbase. Had we flown a little farther, he said, we might have spotted her. But in fact, the Americans did not spot her, nor would anyone else. Walking toward the north and in a stupor, the young men gradually discarded things they no longer needed. Life jackets, heavy leather coats, parachutes, and finally their empty canteens. Blinded and desperate, they fumbled ahead for 78 long miles. But eventually, without food, water, or shelter, they began to fall. And by Tuesday, April 13th, 9 days after their aborted bombing mission, all 9 men were dead. 16 years would pass. Then, a team of surveyors who were searching for oil in the Libyan desert saw something unexpected. It was a large bomber from World War II with American markings. The surveyors notified American authorities, and the investigators who arrived a year later found the Lady Be Good to be in excellent condition. For instance, the men were able to fire one of the bomber's 50 caliber machine guns simply by pulling the trigger. But it turned out to be extremely difficult to locate the bodies of her crewmen. It took 2 years for members of the US Army mortuary team to locate and then to exhume the bodies of 8 of the 9 crewmen. But to this day, the remains of Sergeant Vernon Moore have never been found.